believe in God.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Indian Land Community Church. So glad that you are here today, and looking forward to sort of kind of bringing this problem with God to a close today as we talk about one last thing. Before we jump into it, I'm trying to get to where I'm not going to die here, bouncing around behind this little table. Before we kind of dive into our new stuff, I just want to quickly remind you that we will have everything available for download online. I was having problems with the software this morning, so the notes are not on there yet, but they will be there this afternoon. And of course, the video, barring any issues here with the recording, will be available. So if you want to rewatch it or send it to anybody or have a family member or whatever that needs to see it, it'll be there. You can find all that stuff indianlandcc.com. And go to the download page, and bada boom, bada bing, there you are. So as we're kind of jumping into the problem with God, we've been talking about this problem that people have with God, right? It's not necessarily a problem that God has, it's a problem that we as humans have. And, you know, we've sort of talked about sometimes the problem with God is that he doesn't answer prayers the way we want him to. Sometimes the problem with God is that he doesn't feel like he's close to us, and we're not sure that he's there. And sometimes the problem with God is we just don't think he exists, right? Some people absolutely have put their foot in the ground and said, hey, you know what, I'm taking a stand, God does not exist. And so what we've been looking at over the last several weeks is some scientific evidence that will help us bring truth to people, to bring knowledge to people, to bring understanding that God does not exist. And so we've sort of been working through this apologetics thing, and so we're using the classical apologetic method, which basically just states that God exists, and if God exists, then miracles are possible, and if miracles are possible, then the Gospels are actually reliable accounts of actual events. And if the Gospels are reliable accounts of actual events, then Jesus actually rose from the dead, right? And so if Jesus rose from the dead, like I've said, somebody who predicts and follows through with his death and resurrection and pulls it off, right? You can trust what he says. And so if Jesus rose from the dead, then what he said can probably be trusted. And so this sort of moves us into the conversation with folks as we kind of get there. We have to start with the God exists, and that's what we've been working on. And so throughout this, it's not just been an apologetics series so that we can be better evangelists out there in the world. It's not so that we could have a better grasp of science. It's actually been to help us with our ABCs, our faithfulness in everything that we believe. And so hopefully we've answered some doubts, because we all have them, right? Every day we have a doubt of whether God is listening, whether he's there with us. You know, some days you may just feel like, man, I have fallen so far away from God, I just don't know that he still loves me, right? We all have doubts from time to time. It should help us build confidence, because we all need that, right? If we're going to engage with people in conversation about why Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then we need to be confident in what we're sharing with them and what we believe. And so hopefully through this series, we've been able to build our confidence so that we can pass that along to others. And then the final thing is, hopefully this is changing lives, because that's what the truth of the gospel of Jesus does, right? It changes lives. Those of you who are believers, it has transformed you from the inside out. It has made your life different. Doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have struggles. It just means that when you're in the middle of a struggle, you have hope. You have hope, you have joy, you have peace. Even though chaos and craziness is all around you, Jesus changes lives. And so hopefully he's changing you. And then as you share the gospel and expose Christ to those who are non-believers and they accept him, then he will change their lives as well. Amen. And so We found out a few things through the course of this series. We learned about truth, that it exists, that it's knowable, that it's absolute, that it's discovered, it's not invented. What's true for you is true for me, is true for somebody in China, is true for somebody in Australia. If it's true today, it'll be true tomorrow and forever, right? The truth doesn't change. It exists, it's knowable, it's absolute, and it is discovered. And then we looked at the cosmological argument, which basically this argument broke down the truth or the lie of an eternal universe, right? And so atheists claim that the universe is eternal. And so we showed through the cosmological argument using the surge, right, that there is actually a beginning to the universe. And so if the universe has a beginning, then it had to have a beginner, right? It had to have somebody who started it. If it starts, then it had to have something that caused it to start. And then we got into the teleological argument, and we saw that the universe is actually fine-tuned to support life. If the universe had just very minor differences in the chemicals in the air, in the way the planets are aligned, the tilt of the axis of the Earth, any of those things, if there were any changes, then it wouldn't support life. But the way it exists is fine-tuned to support life. And funny enough is it's only fine-tuned enough for one planet to support life. You know, we've been riding around in a go-kart on Mars looking for life, and it's not there. It hasn't been fine-tuned to support life. And so we looked at the fine-tuning of the universe, and we saw that there's evidence for a designer, right? So for someone who is supernatural, super powerful, all-powerful, that actually put everything into existence. And then we started asking the question, okay, well, if the universe is fine-tuned to support life, where did life come from? And how is it that we have all of these molecules and cells and stuff that make up our body? We had to have an intelligent designer, right? There had to be an origin giving us life. There had to be someone who put it into place. And so as we walked through the evidence that science, again, has given us, we see that evolution can't be true. It can't be true. They're irreducible complexities, right? They're those little flagellum things inside our bodies that they're floating around with their motors that run them all through our bodies, right? And evolution can't cause one of those things to come into existence. And so fine-tuned life, we are created as complex beings, and we were put here by an all-powerful God, and He started life. He started life when He created us. And so that is the origin of life. And so all of these things, again, they don't necessarily point us directly to Jesus, but they get us to the fact that there is something else out there. That there is a supernatural being that we can say God exists. There is a God, and He exists because He's done all of these things. He's revealed truth to us. It's knowable. It's discoverable. Anyway, so today we're going to be digging in on our last thing, and today's topic is the moral argument. The moral argument. And today, I don't know if this is going to be easier or harder for us to navigate through, because this isn't a scientific thing. There is no scientific data set that points to morality. There's nothing. There's not a chemical makeup that shows morality. There's not a theorem. There's not an equation that will, if you plug all the numbers in properly, will give us morality. It just doesn't work that way. So this is a philosophical debate, or conversation, I should say. There's things that we're going to kind of look at and think about today that might stretch us a little bit. Some things that, as we kind of engage people who don't believe that God exists, they may have some arguments that we'll look at today, and hopefully this will equip us to engage in some of those conversations. But the moral argument. So basically, what we're saying is that morality exists, and if morality exists, then there has to be someone who put it into existence, right? If there is a standard by which we're supposed to live, who set the standard? And so that's what we're kind of going to be arguing today, is who set that standard, what is the standard, who set it? And of course, as Christians, we believe that God set the standard, right? God created morality. He gave us what we're supposed to believe and do and trust, and how we're supposed to engage with each other, engage with the world around us. And so He is the standard, because He's unchanging. He's unchanging. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so we're gonna walk through this, and we're gonna get to the point through the moral argument where really we just have to say there is a standard and it's God. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. So again, hopefully the science side of it is sort of done, but this is more of a thinking situation. And again, we're still working logically through this argument. And so our logical statement for today, for the moral argument, is that every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law, and therefore there is a moral lawgiver. And we've every one of our arguments that we've had, we've put them into this logical statement, right? And really, each one of these premises, if the first premise and the second premise are true, therefore 3 has to be true, right? And so if you make this statement and number 2 is false, then number 3 is false. If number 1 is false, then number 2 and number 3 can be questionable, right? It'll probably both end up being false. Maybe 2 is true and 1 is false. But through this, all of it has to end up being true in order for us to logically process through it and prove it as truth, right? And so that's what we're doing. Every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. Another way for us to say this, and again, in conversations with people who don't believe that God exists, that don't believe that there is a moral standard of living, you could say it this way. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist, right? And objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. So we sort of flipped that logical statement around, right? We flipped it a little bit on its head. So if God doesn't exist, because that's what atheists claim, right? If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values do not exist, right? It's the whole, if the eternal earth exists, then God can't exist because he claims to have created it. And if it's eternal, then some made up God, right? So if God doesn't exist, objective moral values do not exist. But as we're going to see, moral values do exist, and therefore God exists. And so we're going to be working through the point of showing God exists using this argument. So how do we know that the moral law actually exists? How do we know? What gives us the evidence that we need to say this? And again, this is a philosophical thing, and we've already said there's not going to be some data set from science that we have to evaluate. We're going to see this in some other ways, and it's really kind of cool once we get into it to see how it all plays out. But the first thing that shows us that the moral law actually exists is that the moral law is undeniable. That it's undeniable. So atheists, they claim that there's no absolute truth, but we've already pointed out that truth exists and it's knowable, right? I mean, that we've talked about being on a truth quest since the beginning of time, right? And we saw that Herod, had Jesus and asked him what is truth, and he walked out, and it's turned from a truth quest to a happiness quest. But atheists will claim that there's no absolute truth, and of course that is defeated in our conflicting statements, right? I mean, when somebody says, well, that's absolutely true, that it can't be true. Well, is that absolutely true? So it sort of defeats itself when atheists claim that there's no absolute truth. And so that's defeated by the question of, is that absolutely true? And then they'll also claim that there are no absolute moral values, that there are no absolute moral values. And this claim doesn't exactly defeat itself. However, if you respond with something like, your opinion doesn't count, they will immediately push back and say, oh, yes, it does. Why do they do that? Why do they do that? Because they have an absolute value. They value their right to share their opinion. It's an absolute value. They absolutely believe that they have the right to share their opinion. And so if they say that there are no absolute moral values, when you tell them that their opinion doesn't count and they push back on it, then this is all you have to say. Your opinion doesn't count. And then all of a sudden, they make the argument. And their argument says that, hey, my opinion is valuable and I have the right to share it. And that right there is the confirmation that it's undeniable. It's undeniable. Let's see. Our second thing here is our relationships help us to discover the moral law. Our reactions, can't read today, our reactions help us discover the moral law. So I want to share a quick story with you to sort of show this, that our reactions actually show the moral law that there is right and wrong, right? That's basically what this is saying, that there is right and wrong. And so our reactions show that. So a student at a major university in Indiana was in an ethics class, right? And so ethics is the same thing as morality, right? It sort of spurs you on to good intentions, good decision making, all that fun stuff. A lot of business degrees require you to take business ethics. So you have the ability to determine whether stealing from the company is ethically right or ethically wrong. And so anyway, so here's this guy. He's in his ethics class, and his professor says, "Okay, look, you got to write a paper for me. It's got to be 20 pages. You have to have all the proper documentation, do all your footnotes, all that fun stuff. You can pick any topic that you want, but it has to do with ethics. It has to do with morality." And so this student, he gets the due date, he understands the project, and he decides that he's going to write on moral relativism. Now, moral relativism, you remember we had relativism in terms of truth, right? What's true for you doesn't necessarily have to be true for me, and we proved that was wrong, right? And so moral relativism is basically the same thing, which means that what is relatively moral for you is not necessarily moral for me. It's just my choice versus your choice, my opinion versus your opinion. And so he says that all morals are relative, and that there's no absolute standard of justice or rightness, and it's all just a matter of opinion. And he writes this paper, and he goes through, and he makes this argument that using chocolate and vanilla, right? And he gets his research together to prove his point, and blah, 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 and he turns this thing in saying, okay, it's just a matter of opinion. There is no absolute moral standard that's out there. I like chocolate, you like vanilla, and therefore that disproves that there are absolute morals that exist. So he puts his paper together, he gets everything pulled together nice and neat. He makes sure he's got all of his punctuation right, he's got all of his footnotes documented properly, puts it into a blue folder, and he actually turned it in early, right? So the professor gets it, he looks at it, he reads through it, he sees that this guy's making the case for moral relativism, and he looks at it and he goes, man, this is a blue folder, I don't like blue, F. And so he writes F on the cover, and he says, I don't like blue. The next day he goes into class and he gives it to the student, and of course, what do you think? What do you think the student, how is he going to react? How's he going to react? Hey, wait a minute, that's not fair. You're F, blue, you hate blue folders. What does that have to do with anything? He goes up to the professor after class and he starts making his case. Hey, look, this is a great paper. I made all my points. I used the correct research. I did all the documentation. It's exactly within the parameters. Why did you give me an F? Because you hate blue folders. And the professor's like, wait a minute, I've read a lot of papers. I've graded a lot of things. Let me take a look at it. Oh, yeah. You argued that it's just a choice, that it's just opinion, right? Moral relativism, that there is no absolute right or wrong, and you like chocolate, I like vanilla, and therefore it's just an opinion. There's no standard. So I hate blue folders. You get an F. Through that explanation, the professor defeated the thought of moral relativism, right? Because this kid who thought that moral relativism was the truth, all of a sudden realized that he was holding his professor to a standard that he wasn't willing to accept existed. Right? If morals are relative, meaning your opinion is that we can beat children, and my opinion is that we cannot beat children, then they're just opinions. Right? If there's no moral standard, if there's no moral absolute, then it's just your opinion against my opinion. And all of a sudden, this student recognizes that maybe morals are absolute. Our reaction helps us discover the moral law. If you're meeting with someone and they say that moral absolutes don't exist, take their phone and put it in your pocket and walk away. What are they going to do? Hey, wait a minute, that's my phone. as my phone. You can't have my phone. If morals are relative, I relatively believe that I can just have your phone. There is no absolute right or wrong answer in that, because morals are relative. And relatively thinking, I want your phone. Right? Our reactions help us discover the standards. Relativism contradicts itself when we see our reactions. One more example to help kind of drive this home on a larger scale. Think back to 9/11. Right? Is anybody on the face of the planet, save the people who did the job, think that flying a plane into a building, killing thousands of innocent people, is morally allowed? No. Not just Americans saw that as wrong, right? People in Europe, people in Germany, people in all over the world saw that, and they recognized that this was an immoral thing to do. The only person who probably saw it as a moral act was bin Laden. He orchestrated the whole plan. Relatively speaking, he would look at that as a morally accurate thing to do. But how do we react to it? Let's flip the script on bin Laden. What if we took his plane and flew it into his building where people that he cared about lived and worked? Would he then see that action as morally relevant? Would he see it as an acceptable activity? Or would he say, absolutely not, that's not cool? My guess is he'd probably say, absolutely not, that's not cool, therefore proving that his reaction would let us know that there is a moral law. There is a moral law. It's absolutely revealed through our reactions. It's not always the standard by which we live, but our reactions show us the way it ought to be, right? It's the way we ought to live. This all kind of points to the way we react to things, the way we see things. We look at it from our personal viewpoint. And Jesus said something about this, right? Over in Mark 12, 30 and 31, when he's posed the question of, hey, what's the most important commandment that we have from God? And he says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other command greater than these. Now, first of all, while we're kind of talking about this whole thing of apologetics and we're using science, that involves your mind. Just FYI. So we've been working on loving God with our mind, recognizing Him, that He exists with our mind, using the things that He's given us. Anyway, so here's Jesus saying, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And you see that point number 2 there? Our reactions help us discover the moral law. If we're going to treat somebody the way we want to be treated, we're going to process things through a moral standard, right? I really want your phone. I'm not going to steal your phone because I wouldn't want you to steal my phone. Because stealing's wrong, right? We understand that inherently. And so Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. He puts it out there. You have been built with a moral code. Use that moral code and treat other people the way that you want to be treated. If there's not a standard of morality, the second command would be useless. It would be useless. It would really open us up to moral relativism, right? If we didn't have morality wired into us, this command of treat others, love your neighbor as you love yourself, wouldn't change anything, right? There's no standard by which to live. all just going to be bad. Everything's going to be up to each individual one of us, in our opinion. How do we know the moral law exists? Well, without the moral law, there would be no human rights. There would be no human rights without the moral law. Now, this is really interesting because we're going to look at a small piece of the Declaration of Independence. Our founding fathers, there's a lot of statements that are in there, a lot of words that are plugged in that make everybody think that everybody who contributed to the Declaration of Independence was a Christian. There's evidence that they weren't, but some were agnostic, which means that they believe that there's a God, they just didn't think they could know God, right? And so, but they still had this moral code, they still had this moral value locked into who they were. And so they used this. They used this when drafting the Declaration of Independence. And so here's what they wrote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So notice that these are self-evident, right? They can be discovered. We find them out. We sort of know what they are. And that they were endowed by what? The Creator. So the founding fathers, when drafting the Declaration of Independence, they said there is a standard. There is an absolute. There is a knowable truth out there that all men are created equal. Human rights exist because we have moral law. If we didn't have morality, we didn't have a moral law, if we didn't have an absolute standard, then human rights wouldn't exist. Wouldn't exist. When the guys drafted this, it wouldn't have really mattered because, they would have just been saying, okay, King George, it is our opinion that we should be free. And King George would be like, nah, it's my opinion that y'all aren't going to be free. Y'all going to still be part of us. It's just a matter of opinion, right? But they set the boundary. And they said, look, there is an absolute here. There is an absolute. And we're going to claim it. I want to point to World War II, right? Again, human rights. If there were no moral law, there would be no human rights. When we get into World War II, why would anybody stand against Hitler? I mean, it's just his opinion against mine that the Jews should not be here. Why would other countries get involved in a big fight with someone who was abusing other people on a mass level? If it's just his opinion against my opinion, it doesn't really matter, right? Because you could have a completely different opinion, and you could have a completely different opinion. There is a moral standard. There is a moral law that exists. Without a moral absolute standard, it would have just been Hitler killing all the Jews, all the Nazis, saying, hey, we agree with Hitler. It's our opinion that he's right. If you guys don't believe us, well, too bad. Stand up against us, we'll kill you, whatever. Nobody would have stood up against them because they would have either agreed with the opinion and joined them, or they would have just not cared. Because there was nothing compelling them to say, this is wrong. But moral absolutes exist. There is a moral standard. And that's why World War II had everybody fighting against Hitler to overcome his disastrous activities that infringed on everybody's human rights, right? The next one, without the moral law, we couldn't know justice or injustice. Without the moral law, we couldn't know justice or injustice. So there has to be a standard for us to recognize if something is just or unjust, right? If you're engaging with someone who's an atheist or a non-believer, and maybe they're not an atheist, but they're a non-believer, they don't believe that God is who we claim that he is and who he says he is, they may throw out this thing of, well, why don't you believe in God? If God exists and he's a God of love, then why does evil exist? Why evil? If God, why evil? Why do bad things happen? The question then becomes, how do we know what is evil? What is bad? If there's no absolute standard, if there's not something to live up to, then how do we know that we're not living up to it? If you don't know that there is a good, how can you know that there's a bad? Right? And so someone who says that God doesn't exist because there's evil in the world, they're actually just proving that God is in the world. Right? You can't have a shadow without sunlight. You can have sunlight and not have shadows, but you can't have shadows without the sunlight, right? You can't have a recognition of what is good or what is bad without having recognition of there being something good. And so let's look at this quote from C.S. Lewis, who, those of you who may not be familiar with C.S. Lewis, he was an atheist before he became a Christian. And as a Christian, he was prolific in writing, and he's got some great books that will challenge you in all kinds of ways. And some of them you may have to read 2 or 3 times before you actually understand them. But anyway, that's beside the point. As an atheist, he writes, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? So what are you comparing it to when you say the world is cruel? What comparison is there? How do you know? How do you know what's cruel? If there's no absolute standard, if there's not something built into you that recognizes wrong from right, then how do you know? It's this realization that led Lewis out of atheism and ultimately into Christianity. And he, like everybody else, can only detect injustice because we're involved in a universe that's created by a just and unchanging God who has put morality deep in us. He has written it on our hearts. In fact, Paul, and we're using scripture today, I know you guys are happy about that, but Paul said this in Romans 2, for the hearers of the law are not righteous before God, but the doers of the law will be justified. So when Gentiles who do not by nature have the law do what the law demands, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their consciences confirm this. So without having the law, because they're Gentiles, right? They're not going to the temple. They're not listening to the rabbis preach. They're not listening to them read the law and the prophets. The Gentiles, they know what's right and wrong. And how do they know it? Because it's been written on their hearts. Because God has put it into us at creation when He made us. He made us in His image. And part of that means that we have an understanding of right and wrong. We have this understanding of what is evil and what is good. If there's not a standard that's being set outside the realm of humanity, then it's just our opinions that are trying to dictate it, and our opinions can change, right? Today I like soup. Tomorrow I do not like soup. Right? There's no standard. There's no standard. So we have to have the creator of the universe setting the standards, putting the absolute moral law in place so that it has authority. And we see, Paul tells us, the Gentiles who do the right things, they make the right decisions, they know when something's wrong, and they do the right thing. How do they know it? They didn't have the law. How do they know it? Because it's built into them. It's built into our consciousness. So how do we know the moral law exists? Without the moral law, there would be no way to measure moral differences. Without the moral law, there would be no way to measure the moral differences. The moral law acts as a yardstick, right? We can look at a couple things, and we do this a lot, right? We kind of compare ourselves to other people, right? We have sort of a standard. Where do we get that standard? I don't know. Anyway, so we have this standard, and we look at ourselves against other people, and it's like, man, I don't measure up quite as much as they do on these things because they're way more generous than I am, right? Or I'm way more friendly than they are. Makes me a better person, we have this measuring stick. But if we didn't have moral law, there would be no measure for the moral differences. So, I want to show you, and we've already sort of touched on someone who is related to this. What about these two people? You recognize them? So, one is Mother Teresa and one is not Mother Teresa. So without a standard, without the moral law, there's no moral difference between them. There's only a difference of opinion. Opinion, I can kill Jews. They're not like me. They're not going to make the perfect race. I'm going to kill them. I'm going to stick them in ovens and burn them to death. I'm going to conduct tests on them and see what they react to. I'm going to starve them. Opinion, I believe that we need to serve people. We need to go to the least of these and love them and care for them. If there's no moral standard, then how do we measure the moral differences? It's just a matter of opinion. Hitler had his opinion. Mother Teresa had her opinion. So what? If we didn't have moral law, there wouldn't be a measuring stick by which to measure their morality. There wouldn't be a way for us to say, this guy is wrong and this lady is right. But all of us, again, going back to our other point of our reaction, when you think about Hitler, what is your reaction? I agree with everything he did, or I hate everything he did. It was wrong. Right? How do we know? Because there's a standard. Going back to C.S. Lewis again. The moment that you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures the two things is something different from either. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral ideas can be truer and those of the Nazis are less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. There has to be a standard. Without a standard, statements like murder is evil, racism is wrong, you shouldn't babies for fun, none of that would stand. There's no objective meaning without a standard of moral law. They're just opinions. They're just opinions. Good, bad, better, worse, they would have no objective meaning when used in a moral sense. We could say, okay, well, this pizza was good, but this pizza was bad. Doesn't have anything to do with morals, right? But when we use it in good and bad, talking about morals without a standard, then it's just an opinion. Because the pizza I think is bad, you might love. And the pizza that you love, I think is bad. It's a matter of opinion, right? There has to be a standard for morals. Moral relativism leads us to a place where there is no moral difference between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. No difference between equality and racism, love and hate, life and murder. All of these things, as we look at this, when you hear that there's no difference between equality and racism and life and murder, and we think about that stuff and it's like, that's absurd. There is a difference. There is a difference. See, if we're working in a world of moral relativism, then there's no difference. And I hope we all recognize that. If that's the case, then moral relativism must be false, right? If we recognize that those statements are absurd and that there has to be a right and a wrong, then that means that moral relativism is false. And what do we learn about truth? There is truth, there has to be a false. A statement can't be both true and false, right? And so with this, if moral relativism is false, then an objective moral law must exist. It has to. It has to. Our last thing, well, one of our last things here on this section. How do we know that the moral law exists? If there were no moral law, we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. If there was no moral law, we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. Many pastors say you don't have to tell sinners that they're sinners, right? They already know. Why do they know? Because they feel shame. Because they know. They know what's right and wrong, right? We experience guilt. We experience shame. So when it comes to right and wrong, when we start making excuses for violating moral law, why are we making excuses? Because we've been found out, right? You're cheating on your spouse, and you're sneaking around doing it. Why wouldn't you just do that in the open? There's no right or wrong. Do whatever you feel like doing. You're stealing from your company. There's no right or wrong. Don't worry about it. When you get found out, what happens? You start making excuses. Well, see, what happened was, I just happened to be walking by her desk and I tripped and fell on her face. And we kissed. And then we happened to be walking by a hotel room. Right? Doesn't work. Doesn't work. We start making excuses because we realize that there's a standard. There's a moral law. We start making excuses. Why make an excuse if there's nothing to excuse? If there's no standard by which to live, why would you start making excuses when you're not living up to it? I mean, it just sort of doesn't make any sense to me. We start making excuses when we recognize that we've slipped up and we've broken a law, when we've done something wrong, right? There's a standard. We all know what the standard is. There is a raft in the ocean. It only holds 4 people, but there are 5 people drowning. Does that prove moral relativism? No. It just means that there's a tough choice that has to be made, and you've got to figure out how you can do your best to save all 5. Right? You see them. Do you drive your boat over and help them out? Or do you say, I'm not getting involved? There is a standard. There is a right answer. And when we don't make the cut and we recognize it, we start making excuses for it. We start excusing it. Why would we excuse it if there is no standard? How do we know moral law exists? Because it's been revealed to us. There are 2 types of revelation that we need to know about. The first is general revelation. General revelation. This is God has put it in our conscience. When it comes to moral law, we're talking about God has put it in our conscience. He has generally revealed it to us because of the way He created us. When we've been talking about science, proving that God exists, general revelation, we can look at the created universe and we can see that there's something big at play here, right? There's something big working that is putting it all together. That is general revelation. We can see what God has done. We can see His activity. That is general revelation. Specific revelation. Specific revelation is Jesus. God sent Jesus and gave us Scripture to reveal it. Right? Specifically, He sent Jesus, and Jesus specifically said, what? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except for through me. God is love. If you don't have love, then you don't know God. Right? He gave us specifics. Jesus gave us specific information, and He gave us the Scriptures. Right? The law and the prophets. God gave those to us. It was a specific revelation with the prophets. He came to them and he gave them a specific message and told them to write it down. God has revealed to us that moral law exists both generally and specifically. And these are the two types of revelation when we get into how God has revealed things, general and specific. These things, you see it, you understand it. There's the stuff that he's made known through his creation. There's specific stuff that he said that he's done. So in the scriptures, what else do we have? We have the 10 Commandments. Now, there are 10 of 633 laws that the Jews had to worry about. But if you look at those 10 commandments and you compare that against what Jesus said in the New Testament, Jesus simple 10, right? The first few tell you how to exchange and interact with God, right? You'll have no other gods before me. Don't take my name in vain. Don't say, oh my God. Don't use his name with profanity stuck on the front or back end of it. Same is true with Jesus, unless you know somebody whose name is Jesus, not Jesus. Or you're praying and you say, hey, Jesus, anyway, you get it. But Jesus gave us this summed up in 2 commands, right? The first few of the 10 commandments are how to engage with God, and then the last few are how to engage with people. And so what do you say? First of all, love God with everything that is in you. Secondly, just as important, love your neighbor as you love yourself. You have a standard. You know what's right when somebody does something wrong to you, right? There is a standard. God has revealed it to us. Love God, love people. So over the course of this series, hopefully what you guys have really taken away from all this, and if you want to take some pictures of this or you want to jot some of this stuff down, whatever, we'll talk about it a little bit tonight. But through the cosmological argument, we saw that there's a beginning. There's a God that exists that is immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. That God is extremely powerful. He created out of nothing, right? Everything that we create, everything that we build, we have it because it already exists. God created something out of nothing. He created out of nothing. Teleological, this was the design thing, right? The finely tuned, intelligent design. God is extremely intelligent. God has a purpose with his design. He didn't just create the universe to create the universe. He didn't put Earth here just because he wanted some blue and green planet to look at, right? He made it with a purpose. And then morality. It's absolute. It's absolutely perfect. And it points to a personal God. See, if God isn't personal, then he wouldn't know how to give us morals that were for our good. If he wasn't personal, we wouldn't understand what morality is all about. And all of this points to the existence of God. And most of it we've done without using the Bible. Right? We've discovered truth. We see what science has pointed to. We see what is revealed in our reactions, in the way that we engage the world, the people around us. And what happened? It all just happened to line up to the Bible. Right? God exists. Miracles are possible. Everything he created ended up being true, and we can find it in this book. It's supported. Science didn't debunk this. Science supports it. God exists. Miracles are possible. That's how we have this book. Because miraculously, he brought it all together. And that's what we're going to dig into in our next series is miracles are possible. But hopefully, as we walk through all of this stuff, you guys recognize that God exists. Hopefully you've obtained some new resources to help you engage in conversations that might be a little bit difficult. Even with the new information, they're going to be difficult, right? Because some people, they've already made up their mind. They have emotional issues. They're angry at God. They don't want to believe in God because they believe that God is not a God of love. and something's happened in their life that has made them angry. Either a Christian happened to them or something terrible in their life. They lost a parent, a grandparent, a child, something has happened. And they've had a negative emotional exchange. But hopefully through all of this, you've seen that there is evidence that the God of the Bible exists, and you can engage with people in this conversation. If you're here today, or if you're watching online and you don't have a relationship with God, you don't have a relationship with Jesus, I want to invite you today to make that decision. If you just confess that, God, I know you exist, I know you're real, I know that your Son came to live on earth and to point us to you, and he laid down his life and he rose again on 3 days later to make it possible for us to have a new life. And I just want you to be my Lord. I want you to be the king of my life. If you just pray that and you say that, then right now, Jesus will accept you as his child. He will save your life for all eternity. And if you do that, I want you to let me know. I want to celebrate with you. Just drop me an email if you're online, just shannon@indianlandcc.com. For the rest of us who are already in a relationship with Jesus, I want us to kind of focus for a few minutes and pray. And I want us to reflect the people that are in our lives, those who are close to us but we know that are far from God, the people who are close to us, where we live, work, and play, where we buy groceries, where we work out, where we go and just hang out, play golf, do whatever it is that we do in our spare time. When you're walking around the circle in your community, think about those people. Think about the ones that God is putting in your life that are close to you, that you can have a conversation with, that you can engage with, and just let them know that God exists and that he loves them. Father God, we love you. We thank you that we have this time, Lord, to see the truth that is revealed to us through your creation, the truth that you have put inside of us, that you know, that we know how to live and how to engage the world because of the way you've made us. And God, just right now, I pray that we would be sensitive to your leading and your direction, and God, that we would be aware of those who are around us, who are close to us, but far from you. And Lord, just help us to engage in conversations using this information that you have given us over the last several weeks, God, to engage in making a reasonable case for the joy and the hope that we have in you. God, I just pray that for those who are in this room who don't know you, Lord, for the ones who are watching online that don't know you, God, I just pray that you would right now just pour your Spirit out on them and reveal yourself to them and get them into a relationship with you. God, I just pray that as we engage the world, that you would work in us and through us. Help us to be good ambassadors for you. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, guys, thank you so much. Appreciate your attention. And we will do some basic cleanup, and then we're out of here. Y'all stay safe out there.